was inspired to do this talk was because I started a project, which I'll be talking about last summer with Kelly Hamby, a new entomologist, and we found a whole bunch of fruit rots that we weren't expecting to find, and they don't really look that different, and yet you control them differently in many cases. So this cheat sheet is sort of a complement to this talk. I wanted you guys to have something in your hands to see the different kinds of fruit rots that are out there and start to get kind of a familiarity with how they can be controlled and how you can tell them apart. So a lot of what I'm going to be saying is sort of summarized very briefly in that sheet. So, raspberry fruit rots. This may look familiar. There's a lot of different fungi that can affect raspberries. And I'm going to be mostly talking about the fall raspberries, although a lot of these will also affect earlier on in the season. The biggest fruit rot problem in our area, of course, is Botrytis, or gray mold. And a lot of people, if we talk, okay, raspberry fruit rots, and you see a mold on your berry, you're gonna probably think, oh, it's Botrytis. So this is our sort of our case study fruit rot. The diagnostic trait for gray mold, as the name implies, is you get this fuzzy gray mold. So pretty straightforward there. And sometimes you don't see any mold on the outside of the berry, but I hope this is a little clear. Hard to take pictures sometimes of this sort of thing, but there's a little fuzz there on the inside of the fruit. So in some cases you can get gray mold just on the inside of the raspberry, and you won't see it on the outside right away. This pathogen affects a lot of different raspberry varieties. It affects the whites, it affects the yellows, it affects some of the blacks, and a lot of the reds. And it can also affect blackberries. So one fruit rot that you may see in your fields, and you may think this is Botrytis, is a very distinct kind of fruit rot. It's called Cladosporium fruit rot. And this is in your handout, but it's got this, and instead of having a grayish color, it's got more of an olive green color. So unfortunately, this is a little darker than I had intended, but it's there in your handout as well. There's a sort of a dark spot. This will form on your fruit in the field. So this was one of the diseases that we found when we were doing field surveys. And sometimes it can look kind of like a lighter bluish gray. This is different from Botrytis physically, in that the growth of this fungus, the Cladosporium fungus, is a lot less fluffy. So it's more of a matted look to it. And we did get one grower who, they called us and they said, I got this thing on my fruit and we're not sure what it is. Maybe it's Botrytis. And I said, okay, send it to me. And she said, oh yeah, it's on a ton of my raspberries. She sent me some pictures and it was pretty widespread. I was surprised. And I got the package and there were probably 30 fruit in there, and it was all Cladosporium. So this has been reported in North Carolina, but not in the field, in open fields. It was reported in tunnel-grown raspberries, and it looked kind of different. There's some of these spots you can see here. So a little bit of a different symptom in the tunnel-grown raspberries, but I guess this was a really big problem in some tunnel systems down in North Carolina. So this is also Cladosporium. Okay, and we haven't seen this spotty symptom in fields in Maryland. So we found this disease, and so I wanted to have some information for you guys on how big of a problem it can be. So we did a simple survey, and this is in no way comprehensive, of 2 farms in the area, looking at Cladosporium in the field. So it's not, the fruit rot incidence isn't terribly high. It's like 5%, as much as 7% of the fruit have it in certain farms. And there is sort of an effect here where here's the center part of the the hedge where you don't have very good coverage, and compared to the outer edge where you have better fungicide coverage. So it does look like we are controlling this to some extent with fungicides, or potentially the diseases may be favored by some of the humidity in the canopy, typical of a mold. So the only challenge with us interpreting this is that there was a lot of Botrytis out there, and what we found was that these berries that had the cladosporium often would get rapidly colonized by Botrytis. And so we're looking at this fruit and we're like, is it cladosporium with Botrytis, or is it just Botrytis? It was really hard to tell sometimes. So these numbers are probably a little lower than reality. And we also looked at impacts post-harvest. So we basically went out and we collected fruit from these same two fields, and we brought it back, and then we stored it under standard storage conditions, the refrigerator. And then we looked at it at 2-week intervals. So by the end of that, it was about maybe 4 weeks afterwards. So that was holding it. No, it was 2 weeks afterwards. So holding it kind of a long time for raspberries. About 70% of the fruit collected on the 11th and the 24th of September had cladosporium. So there's a lot of fruit apparently that have this fungus, but aren't showing symptoms in the field. But if you hold them under cold storage conditions, they can develop symptoms. And work that I did in table grapes back in California, cladosporium is a really big post-harvest problem in many fruits, and it's often a late harvest problem. So it accumulates in the fall, and then your fruit is covered in these spores, and you store them, and then they can get disease. Okay, and then we did confirm that it can cause disease. So this was work that I did with a student where we collected these canes from the field. We wanted to know, can it actually infect unripe fruit? And yes, we found that this fungus can actually infect unripe yellow, unripe pink fruit, as well as red ripe fruit through wounds. So this is a legitimate pre-harvest disease. And not surprisingly, in this red bar here, when we inoculated with a wound, disease was higher. So it's favored by wounding. And I forgot my normal watch, so flag me for time. So the third sort of important, I guess, field disease, it can be important at least in certain years, is late leaf rust. So this is a pretty diagnostic symptom here. You have these orange pustules. These will form on the leaves as well as the fruit, typical rust symptoms in the fall. This is, as many rusts are, it's a fungus that has an alternate host in a very different organism. So the late leaf rust pathogen goes between raspberries and white spruce, maybe other conifers. So this is not the same as the dreaded orange rust. So orange rust is a much worse disease, and it affects the growth of the whole plant. That's not what we're talking about here. So the late leaf rust is much less problematic than the orange rust, but it affects the fruit, where orange rust affects just the whole plant. It doesn't directly cause what you might call a fruit disease or fruit rot. Okay. And then we have this suite of things that can happen on your fruit after you've harvested them. So this is sort of a vignette of things that we found when we harvested fruit and then held them and were studying them. So we found, not surprisingly, rhizopus. Kind of boring. Everybody knows there's rhizopus on raspberries. And again, darker than I would have liked, but there's this guy that we found, and we actually did find him in the field, sort of black, really densely fuzzy growth. We think it might be some kind of mucor. It was only on one experimental variety, though. It seems to be pretty variety specific. The surprise for me, I guess, was finding Calototricum. And so Calototricum is a pathogen that causes anthracnose, fruit rot on strawberries, and it causes bitter rot on apples, and it causes ripe rot on grapes. It's a really big problem on a lot of our fruits, but we don't really think of it being a raspberry problem. But we did find it as a post-harvest problem in raspberries. So, like this was among the samples that I got from several growers this year. I got a bunch of cladosporium, but actually the Calla tatricum popped up a couple times. So this is a little surprising. I guess not too surprising. Okay, so that's your sort of suite of fruit rots in this area that we have found so far. Did anybody have any questions about that, about looking at fruit rots or diagnosing the different fruit rots? Okay. So in terms of managing fruit rots, these management principles are going to be pretty similar to a lot of our other fruit rot problems. So one of the big take-homes is that with all of these fruit rots, the spores on one infected fruit are the source of inoculum for other fruits. So it has secondary infection cycle. So it's important to control spread within the season. And of course, as Carrie was talking about, when you have warm, wet rains, so when you have frogs walking around with umbrellas, then you know that you need to protect your fruit because this is favoring infection and it's favoring spread. Cultural practices are, of course, very, very important. And in raspberries, the canopy can get really dense. So you want to manage the density of that canopy, both because if you promote air circulation, then you're reducing that moisture level in the canopy, and that's going to suppress the sporulation and the infection abilities of the fungus in question. And then there's also the effect on improved coverage. So when you're opening up the canopy, your sprays are going to penetrate better. And as many of you growing raspberries are already struggling with coverage because spotted wing Drosophila is a big enemy of raspberries and requires some pretty intense coverage in order to get into the middle of the canopy. So I think as we're managing for spotted wing and opening up that canopy, we're going to be doing a nice job managing for our fruit rots as well. So there's sort of a co-management benefit there. Okay. So other cultural practices, if you over-fertilize, you can increase the susceptibility of the tissue to many of these fungi. This is very typical for botrytis. So any botrytis problems, in any crop, if you over-fertilize, you're going to increase the susceptibility of that tissue. So you just use basic, you just do tissue analyses to make sure that you're not over-applying your nitrogen. Yes, question?
Any kind of fertilizer using homemade stuff?
It really has more to do with the amount of nutrients in the plant, not so much the source. But if you're using things like compost, they tend to release the nutrients slower, so they can, in many cases, just help moderate nutrient uptake. Yeah. Any other questions? So, and then of course you want to go through and inspect the plants for any disease problems that you need to be controlling. One of the good places to look for fruit rots is not in the edge of the canopy, but in the middle. So if you can kind of poke your head down there, look over into the middle, that's where you're going to see a lot of your fruit rots getting going. It's a good place to detect the early infections. And then, oh yes?
On the previous slide, what was the third thing? There were 3 to 5 games per linear foot.
Okay.
Row width, and those. Oh, okay.
And for the sake of time, I can, so very briefly, for your pruning, you're going to want to separate these out. So about 3 to 5 canes in your row for each foot. And then you want your row width to be standard, about 1.5 to 2 feet wide. And you go for about a wire that's about 4 feet off the ground, 3 feet apart, okay? So that's your basic trellising setup, and then you just bind the canes to the wire up at the high wire point here to keep them from falling in on each other. So, yeah. Okay, so another aspect of monitoring is to look not just at the fruit rots, but at whether or not there's injury problems. And one of the injuries I'm going to talk about more in a minute is injuries from insects. So if you have a lot of insect damage, that might be a situation where you're going to be predisposed to get a lot of fruit rot as well. And that can be a problem because, in honesty, a lot of raspberries are being sold with little insects in them, and people don't really know, and they kind of don't care, especially if it's pick your own. They're probably going to eat it, in the next couple days. So, yeah, maybe it had some little buggy guys in there, but nobody's the wiser. But if it gets mold, then no one's going to eat it. So it can, and then the mold can spread, and then you can get a very nice fruit rot outbreak in your fields. So it can be a compounded problem. All right. And then there's fungicide management. So in the handout I gave you, I do have some specific, just the compounds, not the label rates. So there's some good fruit disease management guides. There's the small fruit fungicide program through University of Maryland. They have all the rates. But basically, take homes here, compounds and timing are going to be different for different fruit rots. Fungicide control is particularly important for botrytis, but then the caveat there is that, as Bob mentioned, that there can be big problems with fungicide resistance. So we have to be careful of rotating what we use and make sure that we rotate our compounds. The cladosporium isn't really considered to be a pre-harvest fruit rot in most places. So I have found there's some work done in the Midwest looking at it and in tunnel systems. So there's a little bit known there, but we're working on getting you guys some more information in the event that this does end up being an issue. And Calototricum, I don't really think is that big of an issue, but it's because it's not an issue, there's nothing labeled for it. Okay, and then late leaf rust. There are some fungicides you can use, but cultural practices are going to be, and resistance, variety resistance are going to be your number ones to go to for late leaf rust and rhizopus cultural practices. Okay, so here's a basic fungicide program overview targeting botrytis, but incorporating in the late leaf rust spray, since those are the two main ones that have labels. So starting at 5 to 10% bloom, through full bloom, you're going to be targeting your gray mold. And you've got some materials here: Captan, Captivate, Elevate, Pristine, Roverall, Switch. These are our standard go-tos for your question for botrytis.
Low impact, I can buy. I'm an organic grower.
Okay.
Or do I just say Holy Mary, Mother of God?
So for organic compounds, what works? Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what is labeled on raspberries for botrytis, but a lot of the, there's some standard. You've got the Serenade compounds. You've got
the one with Serenade is exactly.
So the work that I have seen has mostly been in this region. There's a scarcity of work, but if we look at the work done in the South in strawberries, where there's a lot of interest, there's some good efficacy against botrytis in strawberries for a couple different compounds, and I can talk to you more about that afterwards if you want. But several of the ones that Carrie was mentioning are effective for botrytis in strawberries. Okay. And then petal fall through harvest. So this is obviously with raspberries not a terribly long period of time. It's not like with apples. So starting about 3 to 5 days before harvest and repeating about weekly. If pressure is high, again, you're going to be targeting your botrytis, same as bloom sprays. Remember to rotate. And then leaf rust, you can control with several compounds: Rally, Cabrio and Pristine are some effective compounds for late leaf rust. And only use these if you know that you have this as a problem. I wouldn't say that you need to be particularly vigilant about protective sprays if you've never had a history of late leaf rust on your fruit. Okay, there's several disease-resistant varieties for late leaf rust. So if you're growing something like Heritage, this is susceptible. You might see more problems. Nova is an example of a more resistant variety, and there are several sites out there where you can get information on disease-resistant varieties for late leaf rust. For Botrytis, as with many crops, there's not really resistance. There are some more tolerant varieties, though. Okay, and then in transitioning here to insects. So I've mentioned that insects can be important. For the sake of time, I won't go into this in too much detail, but I will say that we were interested in looking at spotted-winged Drosophila, which is a big insect problem in raspberries, as you know if you're growing raspberries. And we wanted to know whether this might influence fruit rots. So we did a little study here, and we looked at fruit rot development, or we looked at the association of spotted wing with fruit rots. So go forward. So what we did is we did this field survey where we went out and we looked for, are there any moldy berries with spotted wing? And so I just wanted, it's really hard to actually get a picture. So where is that little bugger? There he is, that bastard. So they like to go and hide underneath the fruit, so it's really hard to get a good picture of him. So we tried taking videos. There he is, there he is. So this is a moldy berry, and there's a little spotted wing larvae. So we went and looked for this to see how common is this in the field. So what we found was that actually there were a lot more berries than we thought that had both the mold and the spotted wing, and we looked at both Botrytis and Cladosporium. So these little bars here are just showing you the incidence of those two diseases just by themselves. And then the gray bar is the incidence where we had Botrytis berries that had spotted wing. So about 70% of berries that have Botrytis also had spotted wing. That was interesting. And actually pretty high for Cladosporium too. About 50% of berries with Cladosporium had spotted wing. So this is just incidence of association, but it does tell us they can coexist. And so Kelly Hamby and we went out and we collected a bunch of fruit and we put them in bags, and then we put flies in there, and they're either clean or they had Botrytis all over their bodies. And then we looked at what the disease incidence was. So we found that when we exposed the fruit to the flies with the Botrytis, this is the gray bar, our disease incidence for Botrytis was higher. So it looks like if the flies do have the Botrytis on them in the field, then they may be able to move it around. An unlooked for result was that when we exposed these fruit collected from the field to flies, we also had an increase in Cladosporium. These were not infested flies. We just exposed these naturally infested fruit to the flies, and the Cladosporium went up. So it looks like these might be causing wounds to allow the pathogen that's on the fruit to get into the fruit. This might be partly why we're finding Cladosporium where before, apparently, I'd never seen it really reported in the field. And so this could be an explanation for why we're seeing Cladosporium in the field now. So for the sake of time, I'll just come to some of the conclusions here. The Cladosporium we also found in the larvae, frass. So we made the larvae walk on a plate and they pooped. And Cladosporium is present in the frass, so it looks like the spotted wing is also eating it. So this is a horrible slide, so I'm just going to skip it. So the point is that we think that maybe spotted wing might be an important driver of fruit rots in this area. So that's all I got for today, and thanks so much for your attention.